The knock at the door startled Ayumi from her half-hearted unpacking. The sound echoed through the old house like a gunshot, making the floorboards beneath her feet seemingly shudder in response. She hadn't been expecting anyone, least of all the village elder. When she opened the door, the old man stood hunched on the porch, his dark eyes glinting beneath a wide-brimmed hat that did little to shield him from the relentless mountain rain. Rivulets of water carved paths down his weathered face, and the sight of him sent a shiver up her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. "Ayumi," he said, his voice raspy like dried leaves scraping against stone. "We've prepared the shrine. It's time you take your place." She didn't respond immediately. How could she? The shrine her grandmother had devoted her life to had always seemed a relic of another world, one she'd deliberately left behind when she moved to Tokyo. The bright lights and constant buzz of the city had been her escape from the weight of tradition that hung over this village like a shroud. Yet now, with her grandmother's death and the small plot of land bequeathed to her, she had no choice. Returning had been bittersweet and unsettling, like finding childhood toys in an attic covered in years of dust and shadows. "Thank you, Takeda-san," she finally replied, clutching her sweater tightly against the damp air that seemed to seep through every crack in the old house. "I'll head up there in the morning." The elder squinted at her through the rain, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He hesitated as if to say more, his mouth working silently, before he simply nodded and shuffled away into the growing darkness, his figure dissolving into the gray curtain of rain, like a ghost fading from view. Ayumi rose early the next day, the chill of the mountain air biting through her jacket like hungry teeth. The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern peaks, but already a pearl-gray light suffused the valley, making the morning mist look like spirits rising from the earth. Her grandmother's shrine sat perched on the hillside, framed by ancient cedars, whose branches whispered secrets in the wind. The massive trees seemed to lean inward, creating a natural tunnel that led to the shrine's entrance. It had been years since she'd visited, but the path was etched into her memory like a scar. Stone steps slick with moss that seemed to glow with an inner phosphorescence, a crumbling torii gate whose vermilion paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and the ever-present sound of flowing water from a nearby stream that seemed to whisper her name with every burble and splash. The shrine itself was a modest structure, its once vibrant red paint now faded and peeling like old scabs. Yet it exuded a sense of quiet power, an ancient dignity that even years of neglect couldn't diminish. The worn wooden steps creaked beneath her feet as she approached, each sound seeming to announce her presence to whatever might dwell within. Ayumi pushed open the wooden door, wincing at the protest of rusted hinges. The sound echoed in the still morning air like a cry of pain. She stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Dust motes swirled in the weak sunlight that filtered through paper windows, dancing like tiny spirits in the gray light. A faint incense scent lingered, sandalwood, and something else she couldn't quite identify, as if her grandmother's prayers still hung in the air like invisible cobwebs. The familiar smell brought unexpected tears to her eyes, memories of childhood visits flooding back, her grandmother's gentle hands showing her how to properly arrange the offerings, the soft murmur of ancient prayers, the feeling of being part of something larger and more mysterious than herself. She moved cautiously through the space, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. Cobwebs stretched between the ceiling beams like ghostly fishing nets, and shadows seemed to shift and move in the corners of her vision. As she approached the altar, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed away years of accumulated dust, that's when she noticed it. A small, ornate mirror, resting beneath a protective cloth that seemed to radiate coldness, even from a distance. The cloth itself was covered in faded symbols that made her eyes hurt if she looked at them too long. With trembling fingers, she lifted the cloth. The mirror beneath was beautiful in a way that made her stomach clench with unease. Its surface was dull and speckled with age, but the handle was intricately carved with strange, intertwining patterns that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of her eye. The sight of it stirred an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite name, like remembering a nightmare moments after waking. "What's this?" she muttered, picking it up. The mirror felt unnaturally cold, even through her gloved hand, as if it had been stored in ice for centuries. The metal seemed to actively draw heat from her fingers, making them ache with a deep, bone-penetrating chill. As she peered into its tarnished surface, she thought she glimpsed movement, like a shadow passing behind frosted glass. Just a trick of the light, she told herself, but the sensation lingered like an afterimage burned into her retinas. A faint whisper seemed to brush against her ear, so soft she almost dismissed it, like silk sliding across skin. "Keep the shrine safe." She whirled around, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the room was empty, save for dancing dust motes and lengthening shadows. The wind howled outside, rattling the flimsy walls like skeletal hands demanding entry. Her heart pounded as she placed the mirror back on the altar with shaking hands, and backed out of the shrine, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her retreat with ancient, patient eyes. That night, Ayumi couldn't sleep. The old house groaned and creaked with each gust of wind, its walls seeming to breathe like some ancient, slumbering creature. The sounds reminded her of stories her grandmother used to tell about yokai, spirits that inhabited ordinary objects, lending them a sinister life of their own. She tossed and turned on her futon, the unfamiliar shadows on the ceiling morphing into grotesque shapes that disappeared when she blinked. Her thoughts kept circling back to the mirror, its tarnished surface, and those strange, writhing patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Why had her grandmother hidden it? What role did it play in the shrine's rituals? The questions buzzed in her mind like angry wasps, refusing to let her rest. By midnight, curiosity got the better of her. The rational part of her mind, the part shaped by years of city living and modern education, insisted she was being foolish, but something deeper and more primitive urged her forward. She grabbed a flashlight and jacket and ventured back to the shrine, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the cold night air. The mountain path was eerie in the moonlight, the familiar daytime route transformed into something alien and threatening. Shadows twisted like restless spirits among the trees, and more than once she thought she saw movement in her peripheral vision, only to find nothing when she turned to look. When she reached the shrine, she hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the worn wood. The air felt heavier here, almost oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was trying to warn her away. The stream's gentle burbling had taken on an ominous tone, its whispers now sounding like distant, unintelligible voices engaged in urgent conversation. Inside, the mirror lay exactly where she'd left it, but something about the room felt different. Warmer. Alive. The air seemed to pulse with a subtle energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The weak moonlight filtering through the paper windows cast strange, elongated shadows that seemed to reach for her like grasping fingers. Her flashlight flickered as she approached the altar, the beam growing weaker with each step, as if something was drawing the energy from it. She picked up the mirror again, this time noticing faint characters etched along the edge that she hadn't seen before. They were old kanji, the kind she'd only seen in her grandmother's most ancient scrolls. their shapes complex and somehow disturbing. She traced them with her finger, and the metal seemed to grow even colder at her touch. "What are you hiding?" she whispered, her words visible as puffs of vapor in the unnaturally cold air. The whispering began again, faint and rhythmic like chanting heard through thick walls. She couldn't understand the words, but they carried an undeniable urgency that made her chest tighten with anxiety. Then, as if compelled by an unseen force, she tilted the mirror toward her face. For a moment, her reflection stared back, familiar, yet somehow wrong, like a photograph that's been subtly altered. But then, the image twisted, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Her features blurred and shifted, replaced by a pale, hollow-eyed figure with flowing black hair that seemed to move despite the still air. The face was neither young nor old, neither fully male nor female, but it radiated an ancient malevolence that made her blood run cold. Ayumi gasped and dropped the mirror, the clatter echoing in the small shrine like a gunshot. The whispering ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against her ears like cotton wool. The air seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. "You're not real," she said aloud, her voice trembling, sounding thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. "You're not real." But the mirror said otherwise. Even lying on the floor, its surface seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and she could have sworn she saw a pale hand press against the other side of its surface, like someone trying to break through a window. Over the following days, the village began to change. Or perhaps it was Ayumi who had changed, and the village was merely responding to whatever mark the mirror had left on her. The villagers began avoiding her, their previously polite smiles turning into averted gazes, their friendly greetings becoming hurried murmurs of unease. She noticed the way they whispered behind their hands when she passed, their faces drawn with worry, and something that looked unsettlingly like fear. Children who had once waved to her now scurried inside when she approached, urged by anxious parents who watched her with dark, knowing eyes. Gardens seemed to wilt as she passed, and more than once she caught the gleam of protective Afuda talismans being hung in windows after she walked by. The village itself seemed to be trying to reject her, like an immune system responding to an infection. One particularly gray morning, she spotted Takeda-san making his way through the village, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the damp stones. "Takeda-san," she called out, hurrying to catch him before he could disappear down one of the narrow alleyways. "Do you know anything about the mirror in the shrine?" The old man froze mid-step, his whole body tensing like a rabbit sensing a predator. His expression darkened, deep wrinkles carving valleys of shadow across his weathered face. "You touched it," he said flatly, the words falling between them like stones. She hesitated, guilt prickling at her skin like invisible needles. "I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. What is it?" He shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line that seemed to hold back a torrent of words. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with dread. "Your grandmother was the only one who could keep it contained. That mirror holds a spirit, a restless one. Not evil, perhaps, but hungry. It will call to you, try to lure you into its grasp. Whatever you do, Ayumi, do not look into it again. Some reflections show us things we're not meant to see." She wanted to protest, to demand more answers about what exactly she was dealing with, but the elder turned and shuffled away with surprising speed, leaving her alone with more questions than before. His words hung in the air like smoke, adding to the weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders with each passing day. That night, the dreams began. In them, Ayumi stood in the shrine, but it was different. older, perhaps, or existing in some time that was neither past nor present. She was surrounded by shadowy figures whose faces were hidden by darkness, their forms seeming to shift and flow like ink in water. The mirror lay on the altar, its surface glowing with a pale corpse light that illuminated nothing. Each time she reached for it, drawn by an irresistible compulsion, the figures grew closer, their whispers rising to a deafening roar that seemed to contain every voice she had ever known, speaking words she almost understood but couldn't quite grasp. She always woke up just before touching it, her heart racing and her body drenched in sweat that felt as cold as the mirror's surface. The dreams left her exhausted, but sleep became something to dread, a door through which something waiting and patient might enter. By the third night, the whispers had followed her into wakefulness. They echoed in the corners of her room, in the rustling of the trees outside, in the very beating of her heart. They spoke in fragments of ancient Japanese, modern Tokyo dialect, and languages she'd never heard before, creating a cacophony that threatened to drive her mad. Desperate for clarity, for some understanding of what was happening to her, she began searching through her grandmother's belongings, hoping to find some explanation of what she was meant to do. In an old chest tucked beneath the stairs, its wood worn smooth by decades of handling, she found a worn notebook bound in faded purple cloth. The pages were filled with her grandmother's distinctive handwriting, characters flowing across the yellowed paper like careful brushstrokes. Most entries were mundane, records of shrine visits, ritual supplies needed, prayers offered. But one passage caught her eye, the ink darker and the writing more urgent, as if pressed into the paper with desperate force. The spirit is bound to the mirror, but its influence grows stronger each year. The binding seals are weakening. I see it in the way the shadows move, in the voices that whisper when no one is near. I fear my strength is waning. If I fail to keep it contained, it will seek another keeper. The ritual must be performed without fail. The cost is heavy, but the alternative. I pray Ayumi never has to make this choice. Her stomach churned as she read the words again and again, her grandmother's fear seeping from the page like a stain. What ritual? The notebook provided no further details, as if her grandmother had been afraid to commit them to paper. Or perhaps, Ayumi thought with growing dread, as if something had prevented her from writing more. As the days stretched into weeks, the haunting escalated beyond whispers and dreams. The voice that had once been so faint now filled her head with fragments of words she couldn't piece together, a constant susurration that made it impossible to think clearly. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision like living things, always vanishing when she turned to look, only to reappear closer than before. Objects in her home shifted inexplicably, a cup that wasn't where she'd left it, a chair tilted at an odd angle, her grandmother's photo turned face down on the altar. The mirror's influence seemed to seep into every aspect of her life. Her reflection in other mirrors began to look wrong, like a photograph slightly out of focus. Water surfaces showed ripples when there was no wind, and sometimes, just for a moment, she thought she saw a pale face looking up at her from puddles and ponds. The villagers' initial coldness had grown into open hostility. They crossed the street when they saw her coming, hung fresh protective charms in their windows, and whispered prayers when she passed. One evening, as she walked to the market, her shopping basket clutched tight against her chest like a shield, an elderly woman she'd known since childhood hissed between clenched teeth, "You've brought it upon us." Just like before. Ayumi's chest tightened at the words, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to confront the woman, to demand an explanation, but the villager hurried away with surprising speed, leaving her alone in the growing twilight. The street lamps flickered overhead, their light seeming dimmer than usual, as if something was drawing the brightness from them. Just like before, the words echoed in her mind. Had this happened in the past? Had other shrine keepers faced this choice? The mirror's history suddenly seemed to stretch back further than she'd imagined, its influence rippling through generations like waves in a dark pond. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the house settle around her, Ayumi knew she couldn't keep ignoring the mirror's call. If the spirit sought a new keeper, it had chosen her. Or perhaps it had always been meant to be her. A destiny passed down through her bloodline like an inherited curse. She had to finish what her grandmother had started, had to understand what choice lay before her. She returned to the shrine one final time, the path now as familiar to her feet as her own heartbeat. The notebook was clutched in one hand, its pages containing what little guidance her grandmother had left her. Her other hand gripped a small bag containing items she'd found scattered throughout the house, things she somehow knew she would need, though she couldn't have explained why. The air inside the shrine was thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were breathing, watching her with ancient, patient eyes. The shadows seemed deeper than before, gathering in the corners like pools of ink. The mirror waited on the altar, its surface gleaming with an inner light that cast no reflections. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt as she gripped the mirror tightly. The metal burned cold against her skin. "What do you want from me?" The mirror's surface shimmered like disturbed water, and the pale figure reappeared. This time, it didn't fade or flicker. Its features were clearer now, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow all of these at once. The spirit's lips moved, and for the first time, Ayumi understood its words with perfect clarity. "You must choose," it said, its voice a hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Bind me or release me. The choice has always been yours to make." Ayumi's pulse thundered in her ears like distant drums. She thought of the notebook, of her grandmother's warnings, of generations of shrine keepers who must have faced this same moment. Binding the spirit would continue the cycle, tethering it to the shrine and dooming her to a life of endless vigilance. But releasing it, what ancient force would she be unleashing upon the world? "How?" she whispered, though she already knew, had always known perhaps, the knowledge buried deep in her blood and bones. The spirit's hand reached through the mirror's surface like smoke solidifying, pointing to the altar. Beneath it, Ayumi found what she had expected. A small blade with a handle wrapped in age-darkened silk and a piece of parchment covered in intricate symbols that seemed to move and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The instructions were clear, though the price was steep, a drop of her blood for the binding, mixing her life force with the seals that held the spirit in check, or a piece of her soul for the release, a willing sacrifice to break the chains that had held it for so long. Tears blurred her vision as she made her decision, the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo in her mind, a memory or perhaps something more. Keep the shrine safe. But what did safety mean in this context? Maintaining the bindings that held an ancient spirit trapped in torment, or releasing it to whatever fate awaited? With trembling hands, she raised the blade. Its edge caught the pale light from the mirror, reflecting a truth she had finally come to understand. The villagers found Ayumi the next morning, slumped against the altar, her face pale but peaceful, as if she had finally found rest after a long journey. The mirror lay shattered beside her, its pieces dark and lifeless, no longer reflecting anything but ordinary light. For the first time in decades, the shrine was silent, the air clear of whispers and shadows. The elder knelt beside her, his weathered hands shaking as he closed her eyes. "She's done it," he whispered, his voice heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "The curse is broken." But as he turned to leave, to carry the news back to a village that would soon forget why it had ever been afraid, he thought he heard a faint whisper, not from the shrine, but from the forest beyond. It might have been nothing more than the wind in the ancient cedars, or perhaps it was something else, a voice freed from its prison, or a new guardian taking up an ancient duty. The truth, like so many things in the old mountain village, would remain a mystery, kept safe in the shadows between this world and the next. Ichiro first saw the village, a cluster of thatched rooftops nestled in the shadows of dense cedar forests, as the sun began to set. The dying light painted the sky in shades of deep crimson and purple, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him like grasping fingers. He had been traveling for days, his sandals worn thin and his swords feeling heavier with each step. The path wound through steep cliffs and dark woods, and though he tried to shake it off, the feeling of being watched clung to him like wet silk, a constant whisper at the edges of his consciousness. The journey had been long, testing the limits of his endurance in ways that even his years of samurai training hadn't prepared him for. His sandals bore the marks of countless miles, patches carefully sewn with thread pulled from his own clothing, soles risoled with bark and spare leather, showing the practiced hand of someone who understood that survival meant maintaining what little equipment one possessed. The cedar trees around him stood like ancient guardians, their massive trunks creating a corridor of shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. Their branches creaked overhead, the sound reminiscent of old bones shifting in the wind. His twin swords hung at his side, each blade a testament to battles fought and survived. The katana's tsuka ito wrapping was worn smooth from years of use, while the wakizashi's sagio cord had been replaced 3 times, each knot holding memories of close encounters. Tiny nicks and carefully repaired scratches told stories of close encounters, of moments where skill and luck had been the thin line between life and death. The blades themselves held an almost supernatural sheen, as if they had absorbed something of the spiritual essence from each battle they had witnessed. Ichiro was no stranger to darkness, to the subtle dance between survival and destruction that defined a samurai's existence. Yet something about this place made his battle-hardened instincts bristle with unease. By the time he reached the outskirts, the villagers were already retreating to their homes like scattered leaves before a storm. Their eyes darted toward him, wary but polite, filled with a knowledge they seemed desperate to keep hidden. Children were hurriedly ushered inside, their games left unfinished, toys abandoned in the dirt like offerings to the approaching night. One woman, balancing a basket of rice on her hip, paused to bow deeply. Her fingers trembled against the worn bamboo of her basket, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "Excuse me," Ichiro called, his voice carrying the authority of his station tempered with deliberate gentleness. "Would there be an inn here where I might find shelter?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the darkening sky, as if checking the position of the sun. "There is a place, Samurai-sama, but you must leave by morning." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The Shadow Weaver does not take kindly to outsiders." The Shadow Weaver? Her face paled to the color of fresh rice paper, and she quickly shuffled away without another word, her sandals scraping against the packed earth in her haste to escape. The sound echoed in the emptying street, like the scratch of unseen claws. The mystery hung in the air, a tangible presence that seemed to add weight to the evening's gathering darkness. The name itself, Shadow Weaver, seemed to echo in the spaces between things, in the growing darkness between houses, in the gaps between fence posts where nothing should lurk but shadow. Ichiro found the inn at the edge of the village, a small, humble structure with a flickering lantern at the door that cast dancing shadows on the weathered wood. The paper screens were patched in places, suggesting years of careful maintenance against the elements. The innkeeper, an elderly man with a limp that spoke of an old injury, welcomed him inside but offered little in the way of conversation. His eyes, though, told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, who carried secrets like physical weights. The common room was empty save for the crackling hearth, its flames casting uncertain light across walls that seemed to absorb more shadow than they should. Wooden beams overhead bore the patina of decades of smoke, their darkness seeming to writhe in the flickering light. As Ichiro sat by the hearth, the old man finally spoke, his voice carrying the rough texture of someone who had spent years trying not to speak of certain things. "You came at a bad time," he muttered, setting down a steaming bowl of miso soup. The broth's surface reflected the firelight in ways that made Ichiro think of eyes, watching from dark depths. "The eclipse is tomorrow." "What does that have to do with the Shadow Weaver?" Ichiro asked, his voice calm but firm. The innkeeper's hands trembled as he stirred the fire, sending sparks dancing upward like fleeing spirits. "It's an old tale," he began, though it was clear he wished not to tell it. His fingers worked nervously at the hem of his worn kimono, a habit born of years of anxiety. "During eclipses, the Shadow Weaver comes. It takes people. The villagers say it drags them into the woods, never to be seen again. Their screams..." He shuddered, leaving the thought unfinished. Ichiro's lips pressed into a thin line. Superstitions. He had heard countless tales like these in his travels, myths woven to explain disappearances, bandit attacks, or simple bad luck. Yet there was something in the old man's voice, a tremor of genuine terror, that gave him pause. Still, as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls like the voices of the damned, he couldn't ignore the unease settling in his chest. It was a feeling he knew well, the calm before battle, when every sense heightened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. That night, Ichiro's dreams were restless, filled with images that seemed to seep through the barriers between sleep and wakefulness. He saw flashes of shadowy figures darting through the trees, their elongated limbs bending in unnatural ways that defied both physics and sanity. Whispers echoed in his ears, unintelligible yet filled with malice, speaking of ancient hungers and forgotten sins. When he awoke, the room was icy cold despite the glowing embers in the hearth, and patterns of frost traced impossible shapes across the paper screens. The next morning, the village was eerily quiet, as if sound itself had been stolen away by some unseen force. Even the animals seemed subdued, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. Ichiro stepped outside and found the streets nearly empty, the usual morning activities abandoned. A few villagers lingered at their doors, watching him with a mix of fear and pity, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed look of those who had not slept. "Stay indoors," an old woman warned as he passed, her voice cracking with genuine concern. Her fingers worked prayer beads with desperate intensity. "Do not look at the sky. It sees through the eclipse, uses it like a gateway." He nodded, more out of politeness than belief, and continued toward the forest. The weight of his swords provided familiar comfort as he walked. If there was something lurking there, bandits, a wild animal, or even this so-called Shadow Weaver, he would find it. It was his duty as a samurai to protect those who could not protect themselves, even if the threat came from the darkness itself. The forest was dense, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in fragmented beams that seemed to pierce the gloom like spears. Ichiro moved silently, his hand resting on the hilt of his katana, feeling the familiar wrap of the tsukaito beneath his fingers. The further he ventured, the colder it seemed to grow, until his breath misted in the air, like ghost smoke. A faint, unnatural mist curled around the base of the trees, muffling his steps and carrying the sweet rot smell of decay. He paused when he saw it, a clearing up ahead, the ground littered with shredded cloth and broken sandals, artifacts of violence that told silent stories of terror. Ichiro knelt to examine the scene, his sharp eyes noting the signs of struggle. No blood, but something had happened here. The earth itself seemed tainted, darker than it should be, as if shadows had seeped into the soil like spilled ink. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the trees, high-pitched and childlike, yet wrong in a way that made his skin crawl. He stood, his muscles tensing as he turned toward the noise. The laughter came again, this time from his left, then his right. It seemed to circle him like a predator, always just out of sight. "Show yourself," he commanded, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade through silk. The response was a whisper, so soft he barely caught it, yet it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees, from the ground, from the very air itself. "Run." The eclipse began as Ichiro returned to the village, the sun's light failing with unnatural speed. The sky darkened as if ink had been poured across it, the temperature plummeting until frost formed on the edges of leaves and roof tiles. Villagers locked their doors and shuttered their windows, but Ichiro stood in the square, watching the sun disappear behind the moon. A thin ring of light remained, casting the world in an eerie twilight that seemed to bend and twist reality itself. The whispers began again, faint but growing louder, a chorus of voices speaking in languages that had never known human tongues. Ichiro turned, his eyes scanning the shadows that crept across the ground. They moved unnaturally, slithering toward him like living things, like hungry serpents made of darkness itself. "Samurai-sama," a voice called, desperate. He turned to see a young girl standing in the doorway of a small home, her face pale with terror, her eyes wide with a knowledge no child should possess. "Help us." Before he could respond, a shadow leapt from the ground, enveloping her like a wave of liquid darkness. She screamed, but it was cut short as the darkness dragged her back into the house, her small hand reaching out one last time before being swallowed by the void. Ichiro ran after her, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since his first battle. But the doorway was empty when he reached it. Inside, the room was cold and silent. The only trace of the girl, a small wooden hairpin lying on the floor, its lacquer surface dulled, as if something had drained its very essence. The village descended into chaos as more shadows began to move. Screams echoed through the streets as people were pulled into the darkness, their cries fading as quickly as they began, leaving behind only the sound of rushing wind and that terrible childlike laughter. Ichiro's grip on his katana tightened until his knuckles were white. These were no bandits, no wild animals. This was something far worse, something that lived in the spaces between reality and nightmare. He moved swiftly through the village, cutting at the shadows that lunged at him. His blade met resistance, as though slicing through thick fog, but the shadows dissipated with a hiss each time, leaving behind the scent of burning frost. Yet for everyone he destroyed, more seemed to rise from the ground, from the walls, from the very air itself, as if the darkness was endless and hungry. Ichiro reached the center of the village, where the torii gate leading to the shrine stood like a sentinel against the supernatural darkness. The air here was thick with malevolence, and the whispers were deafening, a cacophony of voices speaking of ancient hungers and forgotten sins. He stepped through the gate and found himself face to face with it. The Shadow Weaver was a towering figure of darkness, its form shifting and writhing, as if made of smoke and nightmares given form. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, like ancient amber holding trapped evil, and its elongated limbs reached toward him like grasping claws made of condensed shadow. The very air around it seemed to bend and twist, as if reality itself recoiled from its presence. "Why do you come here, samurai?" It rasped, its voice layered and hollow, like 1,000 voices speaking from the bottom of a well. The sound seemed to pierce directly into Ichiro's mind, carrying with it images of darkness and despair. Ichiro raised his blade, steady despite the chill running through him. The steel caught what little light remained, seeming to glow with an inner fire. To end this. The weaver laughed, a sound that echoed painfully in his ears and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "You cannot destroy me. I am born of the sins of this place, their guilt, their hatred, their secrets. I am eternal as the shadows themselves, as old as fear, and darker than the spaces between stars." "Even eternal things can be severed," Ichiro replied, his voice carrying the weight of conviction earned through countless battles. The fight was unlike any Ichiro had ever faced, a dance of blade against shadow that defied the laws of nature. The weaver moved with impossible speed, its limbs striking like whips made of concentrated darkness. Ichiro's blade sang as it sliced through the air, meeting the weaver's attacks with precision born of years of training and survival. Each strike seemed to weaken the creature, its form flickering like a dying flame. Yet with every blow, Ichiro felt the weight of the weaver's words pressing into his mind like cold needles. The sins of this place, their guilt, their hatred, their secrets. He saw visions of dark deeds done in darker times, of sacrifices made in the name of survival, of betrayals that had fed the creature's power over generations. He thought of the villagers, their fear, their silence, their unwillingness to confront the truth that had grown in their midst, like a poisonous flower. And he thought of his own past, the blood on his hands, the lives he had taken in the name of duty and honor. The weaver fed on these things, drawing strength from the darkness in every soul it touched, a darkness Ichiro knew all too well. But Ichiro was no stranger to darkness. He had lived with it, carried it, and learned to wield it like a weapon. He channeled that darkness now, using it to fuel his resolve rather than let it consume him. With a final powerful strike that seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality, he severed the weaver's form, the katana cutting through its core with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The creature let out a piercing scream that shattered windows and shook the earth, its form disintegrating into shadows that scattered on the wind like ashes from a funeral pyre. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air, leaving behind only the clean scent of rain and cedar. When the sun returned, breaking through the eclipse like dawn after the longest night, the village was silent, but forever changed. The remaining villagers emerged slowly, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, but also with something new, understanding. Ichiro stood at the shrine, his blade dripping with inky black residue that evaporated in the growing light. He turned to face them, his expression grim, but compassionate. "The weaver is gone," he said, his voice carrying across the square like a temple bell. "But its roots remain in the darkness of human hearts. You must confront what you have buried, or it will return." Shadow feeds on silence and secrets. The villagers bowed their heads, their shame palpable but mixed with relief and the first stirrings of hope. As Ichiro walked away, the elder approached him, pressing a small charm into his hand. It was warm to the touch, glowing faintly with an inner light that seemed to push back the shadows. "For protection," the old man said, his eyes clearer now, free of the fear that had clouded them. "You have saved us, Samurai-sama. May the spirits watch over you on your journey." Ichiro nodded, tucking the charm into his robe where it rested against his heart. As he left the village behind, following the path back into the forest that no longer seemed quite so dark, the whispers of the Shadow Weaver lingered in his mind. They served as a reminder that some battles are never truly won, that the line between light and darkness runs through every human heart, and that true courage lies not in being fearless, but in facing our fears and the darkness within ourselves. The sun continued its journey across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the echo of an ancient drum, calling him toward his next battle against the shadows that lurked in the hearts of men and the spaces between worlds. Hana first saw the studio on a rainy afternoon in late September, when the air hung heavy with autumn's melancholy, and fallen leaves clung to the worn stone paths like desperate hands. The village elder, a man with a weathered face and eyes like faded ink, had led her through winding streets that seemed to fold back on themselves like an origami puzzle. They stopped before a modest building at the edge of town, its aged wood dark with decades of rain and secrets. Its wooden sign hung crookedly, reading Kazue silks in peeling gold paint that caught the gray light like dying fireflies. The sight of it stirred a strange mix of excitement and unease in Hana, as if she were standing at the threshold of something both wonderful and terrible. This was Kazue-san's place, the elder explained, his voice low and careful, like someone speaking near a sleeping predator. His gnarled fingers worried at the hem of his jacket, a nervous habit that spoke of deeper anxieties. She was the best weaver in the region before she disappeared. No one has used the studio since. It's yours now if you're willing. The last words carried a weight that suggested more than just a simple business transaction. Hana nodded, clutching the straps of her backpack where they dug into her shoulders. The fabric of her jacket was damp from the persistent drizzle, making her feel somehow more vulnerable. "I'll take it," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of uncertainty in her chest. The elder studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for something specific, fear perhaps, or understanding. Then he handed her the key, its brass surface worn smooth by countless hands. "Be careful," he said, the words falling between them like stones in still water. "Kazue's threads have a way of lingering." Inside, the studio smelled of dust and old wood, with an underlying sweetness that reminded Hana of incense and decay. Shafts of pale light filtered through the warped shoji screens, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance when viewed from the corner of her eye. They illuminated the tools of a trade left untouched, a loom with its frame still taut with thread, spools of silk in faded jewel tones that retained a ghostly luster, and scissors dulled with time, but still bearing an ominous gleam. Hana ran her fingers over the loom's frame, her skin prickling as though the air itself held its breath. The wood felt warm beneath her touch, warmer than it should have been in the cool autumn air. She set her bag down and began to unpack, each item she placed seeming somehow diminished in the strange half-light of the studio. For Hana, the studio was more than just a workspace. It was a fresh start, an escape from failure. The move from Tokyo had been abrupt, prompted by mounting failures in her career as a textile artist. Her exhibitions had gone unnoticed, her pieces criticized as soulless and derivative. The vibrant chaos of the city had offered little solace, its noise drowning out her creativity, until even the simplest patterns felt forced and hollow. Here, in this quiet village where traditions still held sway, and the modern world seemed to fade like an old photograph, she hoped to find inspiration. But as the days passed, measured by the slow drift of shadows across warped floorboards, Hana couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The loom creaked at odd hours, its threads swaying gently as if stirred by unseen hands. The sound would wake her in the darkest part of night, when the moon cast long shadows through the screens and the world seemed to hold its breath. Once, while organizing spools of thread that seemed to multiply when she wasn't looking, she found a single black strand woven tightly among the silks. It was coarse, almost brittle, and far too human. When she held it up to the light, it seemed to absorb the sunshine rather than reflect it. "Probably Kazue's," she murmured, though the explanation did little to calm her nerves. The strand felt wrong between her fingers, like touching something that should have remained buried. By the end of her first week, as autumn rain drummed against the roof like ghostly fingers, Hana decided to try the loom. It had been years since she'd used one, but her fingers remembered the motions, moving with a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign, as if someone else's muscle memory had been grafted onto her own. As she worked, the studio seemed to come alive around her, awakening from a long slumber. The air grew warmer, thick with anticipation, and the wooden floor creaked in time with her movements like an ancient heartbeat. The faint scent of jasmine filled the room, sweet, but with an underlying note of decay. Her first piece was a simple scarf, woven from threads of emerald green and gold that seemed to catch light that wasn't there. It wasn't perfect. The pattern wavered in places where her concentration had faltered, but it felt like progress, like breaking through a wall that had contained her creativity. She hung it by the window to admire it in the morning light, proud of her accomplishment. As darkness fell, the colors seemed to shift and dance in the shadows, creating patterns she didn't remember weaving. That night, Hana dreamed of Kazue. The woman appeared as a faint silhouette against the darkness, her long hair flowing like ink in water, spreading through the air in impossible patterns. She stood at the loom, her hands moving with inhuman speed as she wove a tapestry of shadows and whispers. The threads she worked with were black as night and seemed to writhe with a life of their own. When Kazue turned to face her, her eyes were hollow pits that seemed to go on forever. Her mouth twisted into a silent scream that echoed in Hana's bones. Hana woke with a start, her breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged in the unnaturally cold air. The studio was silent, save for the faint creak of the loom and what might have been the whisper of silk against silk, though no wind stirred the air. Word of Hana's work spread through the village like ripples in still water. The villagers, skeptical at first, began stopping by to admire her pieces. Their eyes would go wide at the sight of her works, and they'd touch the fabric with trembling fingers, as if receiving a benediction. They praised the vibrant colors and intricate patterns, comparing them to Kazue's legendary craftsmanship, with a reverence that bordered on fear. Orders poured in, and for the first time in years, Hana felt a sense of purpose, though it was tinged with something darker that she couldn't quite name. But the more she worked, the stranger her creations became, evolving into something that straddled the line between beauty and horror. Patterns she didn't remember weaving appeared in the fabric like fever dreams made manifest. A pair of hands, reaching from the edges, with too many fingers, a shadowy figure standing beneath a tree whose branches moved without wind, a single unblinking eye that seemed to follow viewers around the room. Her clients seemed unbothered, even enamored by the designs, but Hana couldn't shake the unease they stirred in her, the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own when darkness fell. One evening, while examining a finished piece under the sickly glow of her desk lamp, she noticed something embedded in the fabric. It glinted like a spider's web caught in moonlight. A thin strand of black hair woven so seamlessly it was almost invisible. Her stomach turned as she pulled it free, the strand snapping with a faint, unnatural tension that felt like the breaking of something vital. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the shadows that seemed to grow deeper with each passing moment. The dreams returned with greater intensity, bleeding into her waking hours, until she could no longer tell where sleep ended and reality began. Each night, Kazue's figure grew clearer, more substantial, as if she were pulling herself back into the world one thread at a time. Her movements became more frantic, more desperate, the loom in Hana's dreams no longer producing tapestries, but something else entirely. Twisted, writhing forms that seemed to pulse with life and agony. The hollow void of Kazue's eyes bore into Hana's soul, and her silent screams grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of unspoken horrors that lingered even after she woke. Determined to find answers before she lost herself completely, Hana began researching Kazue's disappearance. The village elder was reluctant to speak at first, his weathered face creasing with fear when she mentioned the black threads. But eventually he relented, his words carrying the weight of long-buried secrets. "Kazue was gifted," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow and something that might have been guilt. But she was obsessed. The talent consumed her, like a fire burning through paper. She wove day and night, barely eating or sleeping, as if she were trying to capture something that kept slipping through her fingers. Her work became darker, more disturbing. Some said she was weaving people's souls into her fabric, trapping their essence in patterns of silk and shadow. Hana's throat tightened, remembering the faces she'd seen in her own work. What happened to her? The elder shook his head, his hands trembling as he clutched his teacup. One day, she vanished, as if the shadows she wove had finally claimed her. All that was left was her loom, and a tapestry no one dared to touch. We sealed it away, but perhaps some things can't be contained. That night, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist, Hana approached the loom. Its frame was illuminated by the flickering glow of her desk lamp, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach for her with eager fingers. She ran her hands over the threads, feeling their unnatural warmth, the way they seemed to quiver at her touch like living things. "What are you?" she whispered into the gathering darkness. The room seemed to contract around her, the shadows pooling at her feet like spilled ink. As if in response to her question, the threads began to move of their own accord, weaving themselves into an intricate pattern that hurt her eyes to look at. Hana watched, frozen between fascination and horror, as the tapestry took shape. It depicted the studio, but not as it was. The room and the fabric was alive with malevolent energy, writhing with shadowy figures that reached toward the viewer with hands that seemed to move when she blinked. A soft whisper filled the air, like silk sliding against silk. "Finish it." Hana's hands moved against her will, gripping the shuttle and continuing the work that Kazue had begun. Her body obeyed the command, but her mind screamed in protest as she watched herself weave darkness into reality. The tapestry grew, its images shifting and pulsing with a sinister life that seemed to feed on her fear. She saw faces she recognized, the villagers who had purchased her work, now transformed into masks of eternal agony. They stared back at her from within the fabric, their expressions frozen in silent despair, trapped between threads of black silk and shadow. When the final thread was in place, the whispers stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it rang in her ears. Hana collapsed to the floor, trembling, her hands raw and bleeding from working the loom. The tapestry hung before her like a window into hell, its surface shimmering as if it were breathing, as if all the souls it had captured were trying to break free. The next morning, Hana awoke to find the studio empty, though the air still thrummed with residual power. The tapestry was gone, as if it had never existed, and the loom sat silent and innocent in the pale light of dawn. She stepped outside, the sun blinding after the darkness of the night. But something was wrong. The light seemed hollow, as if it couldn't quite touch the world properly. The village was deserted, an empty stage after the final act. Doors hung open, swaying gently in a wind she couldn't feel, and the streets were eerily quiet, not even birds daring to break the silence. Anna wandered through the empty alleys, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped thing seeking escape. At the edge of the village, where the road met the ancient forest, she found them. The villagers stood motionless, arranged in a perfect circle like abandoned dolls, their faces blank and their eyes wide and staring at something she couldn't see. Each was wrapped in a piece of her fabric, the threads binding them tightly, like loving embraces that had turned to chains. The black strands pulsed faintly with an inner light, as if they were feeding on something essential, something human. Hana stumbled back, her mind racing as the full horror of what she had helped create crashed over her. She had to destroy the loom, had to end this before the darkness could spread further. Whatever power it held, whatever hungry thing Kazue had awakened, it couldn't be allowed to continue. Back in the studio, she doused the loom in kerosene, the sharp smell cutting through the sweet decay that had permeated the air. Her hands shook as she worked, splashing the accelerant over wood that seemed to drink it in eagerly. She struck a match and hesitated, the flame flickering as she stared at the ancient wood that had witnessed so much horror. "You can't," a voice whispered, like silk tearing. Hana turned to see Kazue standing in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on the loom, her form flickering between solid and shadow. Her hair moved in unseen currents, reaching toward Hana like grasping fingers. "Why?" Hana demanded, her voice breaking. "Why did you do this?" Kazue's form flickered, her mouth twisting into a mournful smile that showed too many teeth. "To be remembered," she said, her voice echoing with the screams of all those she had trapped. "To weave myself into the world so deeply that I could never be forgotten." Before Hana could respond, Kazue vanished like smoke in a strong wind. The flame in her hand burned low, but she held it steady, understanding now that some art was too dangerous to exist, some creations too hungry to be allowed to continue. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and old silk, she dropped the match. The fire roared to life with unnatural eagerness, consuming the loom and filling the studio with acrid smoke that formed faces in its coils. Hana stumbled outside, coughing as the flames engulfed the building that had housed so many dark dreams. As the fire died down, she felt a weight lift from her chest, like a thread being cut. The whispers were gone, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. But when she turned back to the village, she saw the villagers still standing in their circle, their eyes fixed on her with an awareness that was somehow worse than their previous blank stares. The black threads binding them had vanished like dew in summer sun, but their expressions were unchanged, as if they had seen something that had forever altered their perception of reality. Slowly, they began to move, their blank faces turning toward the burning studio. Without a word, they walked past her, disappearing into the forest like shadows at noon, leaving Hana alone with the weight of what had happened. Hana stood alone, the charred remains of the loom smoldering behind her like a funeral pyre. She knew she had stopped something terrible, had prevented more souls from being bound in threads of shadow. But at what cost? The faces of the villagers haunted her, their silent despair etched into her memory like patterns in silk. As the sun set, painting the sky in colors that seemed faded and wrong, Hana turned toward the road leading out of the village. She had come here seeking inspiration, but all she found was a truth too dark to bear. That art, like love, could become a hungry thing, consuming both creator and audience in its desperate need to exist. Her hands, once skilled at weaving beauty, now felt stained with something she could never wash away, marked by patterns that would haunt her dreams until the day she died. Behind her, in the ashes of the studio, a single thread of black silk danced in the wind, waiting for the next weaver to discover its dark potential.